right along. Of Government and Public Policy, as well as the chair of the Climate Education Committee and the Deputy Vice Provost for Advancement in Learning at Harvard University. So without any further ado, Dustin, if you're here. There you are. Okay, come on up. Oh, so sorry, quick housekeeping note. So Dustin will speak for approximately 30 minutes, yep, plus minus, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So Dustin, over to you.
Great. Thanks. We're going to be able to, there we go, great, perfect. It's great to be here. Thanks so much to the CAPS Unlock community, as well as all of you for being here. This is my first time in the country. I arrived here at 4 in the morning. I did not sleep at the hotel this morning, and sometimes when I'm overtired, I will talk too fast. But in the context of there being translation, I'm going to be trying my very hardest to go at a nice pace, lest I give my colleagues in the back of the room a heart attack. So I'm really excited to be here with you. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some different policy issues related to climate change, largely things around the mitigation of or reduction in our emissions, and then connect that conversation to why I see education in this space to be absolutely crucial. And so we're going to set up the conversation by talking about some of the policy challenges that countries around the world will face, and then we'll connect that to why education is going to be such an important part of this conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the intersection of a couple of different things. The first is climate policy, and here I'm really talking about reductions in emissions. There's lots of other policy that's going to deal with adaptation and how we deal with changing temperatures. I'm not going to talk so much about that today. And I'm going to connect that to discussions of trade. So countries trade with each other. And then finally, there's the flow of money, not just goods. So if you think about trade as the flow of goods across borders, there's the flow of money across borders too. And this is an area that is really important in the climate space. Now, importantly, this intersection between these things is not new to the climate space. For example, there have been debates between countries about agricultural products of different sorts. But climate policy is very different in, I think, a couple different respects. The first is just the massive broad-based effects of climate change and the implications that that will have for economies and societies throughout the world. It's also so much bigger because of the range of economic systems that are implicated. The energy system as a whole, Kazakhstan being a major energy producer, but also things like insurance. What are insurance markets going to do? Sometimes people talk about sunny Florida in the United States. I'll give you a piece of advice. Do not invest in real estate right now in the state of Florida. Well, maybe for the next couple years it'll be all right. And then finally, the underlying incentive problems are a little bit different. You can think about this as a giant public good problem where any contribution to emissions made around the world, the planet doesn't really care where it came from. The United States, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, doesn't really matter. So what I want to do is I want to lay out different components of how we might design policies to deal with climate change. The first is making sure that these are durable and long-lasting policies. Now, I'm a political scientist, and so durable and long-lasting means that our political institutions, our political leaders, keep these policies in place over the long term. And that's really important because unlike some other policy areas, this is going to be a 50, 100, 150-year battle. This is not going to be something that we will be able to solve in the next 10 years. It simply won't be. The second is we really have to make efficient use, so not wasting money, of both private and public capital. And why is this so important? Well, you know what? We're here talking about climate, but there are lots of other topics out there, education, health, that want access to the same money that we're going to need in order to do things around climate. And so if we're wasting our money fighting climate change, there are going to be others to say, hey, we can use that money in a better way. There also needs to be co-benefits. So what do I mean by co-benefits? These could be things that as a result of our policies around climate, it actually has benefits for other things. So for example, health benefits. It turns out one of the best ways to compel people around climate is not that they're going to save the planet, it's that they have their own clean water and air, simply put. Another dimension is that particular communities and economic sectors of countries are going to be differentially impacted. That is to say, some are going to be hurt much more than others. My father's family comes from the state of West Virginia in the United States. And this is a place that produced a lot of America's coal. We're trying to get away from coal. Their economy has plummeted, creating massive public health problems. This will be the case throughout the world. Real reductions in emissions need to be monitored and verified. Just because someone's saying they're doing the right thing doesn't mean they are. And then finally, there needs to be meaningful international cooperation. It simply does not matter if one country does something on their own, if Germany goes and does this, so on and so forth. It simply won't matter, for example, if areas such as Central Asia or the Global South do not decarbonize. This literally has to be everyone. Okay, so with those design principles in mind, I want to kind of run through what are some of the things that are happening throughout the rest of the world. And then we're going to take some of those things and think about the implications that they have for areas like Central Asia. And then I'll conclude with talking about what this implies for how we should design our educational systems. So in the United States, we've had lots of different things that we've tried. We've tried to get through putting a price on carbon. That's proved to be very difficult. The European Union has been able to do some things. They've actually done a lot of things, some of them more effective than others. One of the things, for example, that they've done particularly effectively is thinking about the transition of labor markets. So areas in Europe that were very reliant on producing fossil fuels, they've really thought hard about how to translate the skills that those workers had into new skills that could be leveraged in other sectors. That's something that the United States has really struggled with in a lot of ways, and it's something that you will see countries around the world struggle with as well. Recently, you might have heard about a major policy in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. Notice that the title itself had nothing to do with climate. That's good politics. So this is going to spend a lot of money. It's going to give people incentives to invest in things like renewable energy, essentially by giving you tax breaks, right? The problem with the Inflation Reduction Act is it's expensive. When you're saying we're going to give you a tax break, that then means the government isn't collecting that money. So even in countries that are very well capitalized, that have lots of money, they will face struggles. These are different investments that are being made in the United States from these things. So it's pretty spread out across the country. But here's a plot that sometimes people don't sort of fully grasp the stakes of a transition away from fossil fuels. So when you extract coal or oil or gas, in many states, they will collect revenue from that. For example, the state of Wyoming will use that money that is paid to them by oil and gas companies, and that's what pays for public schools. That's what pays for roads. We're talking about 40 to 50% of their budget is coming from these sources. That view is very similar across many other parts of the world. So when you think about the transition away from the usage of fossil fuels, you've got to dig deep and understand all of the different implications that has. That means for the state of Wyoming, they will not have money to run their school systems until they figure out some mechanism to replace that revenue. The European Union, well, congratulations, my European colleagues. You guys have been doing a lot of things for a lot of time, and it's very exciting. But at the same time, there's backlash. It is not simply something that you can enact these policies that more or less are going to make things more expensive for people to do stuff. It's better for the environment, yes, but it's going to make it a little bit more expensive. And politically, then you get backlash. And so when I talk about durable policies, you have to think about how do you have a policy that's going to be resistant to backlash for those who are systematically disadvantaged due to this. And in the European Union, a big source of this is around agriculture. It's the farmers that are upset. So it'll be really interesting to see, for example, even between the United States and the European Union, what's going to happen. One of the things that is already happening is the use of something called border adjustment mechanisms. And my apologies to the translators, this is going to get a little nerdy. I'm going to talk about that for a second, and then talk about some finance things, and then I'll close with talking about education topics. All right, so what is a border adjustment mechanism? Here's the basic idea. When you charge a price on carbon, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, dear industry, we want you to emit less carbon, and we're going to force you to do that by having you pay for any carbon that you release into the atmosphere. So the European Union did this for many years, and the problem that they faced was something called carbon leakage. And what this meant was that if you were a manufacturer of, say, steel, you could decide, do you want to manufacture your steel in the European Union and pay that extra price? Or maybe you'll go to some other country that doesn't have a carbon price, make your steel there, and then export it into the European Union. And so this is what had started to happen. The European Union had passed this carbon pricing system, and manufacturing started to go to countries that did not have a carbon price. And the net result then was maybe we're not decreasing our emissions quite as much as we thought we were. So what the European Union has now done is they've passed something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And what this is going to do is across a range of different industries, they're going to charge a tariff on imports into the European Union based upon the difference between the price of carbon in the European Union and the price of carbon in the country that was exporting. As such, if a country does not have a price of carbon, they will pay a tariff equal to the amount that the European Union charges itself. End of the nerdy stuff. So this is coming, right? It was just put in place. We're in a current trial period of about a year as companies get used to this idea, and then this will be in place. So right now, this is a policy that's going to cover cement, electricity, fertilizer, hydrogen, iron and steel, and aluminum. The United Kingdom is adopting a similar scheme. And even in the United States, there are bills in our Congress that are considering something like this. So what this is going to do is it's going to force other countries that trade with the European Union to think, hey, maybe we should have a carbon price. Otherwise, we're just giving money away to the Europeans. And that is a big question. There's even discussion of extending this from beyond simply carbon to other things like methane. Sometimes people refer to methane as natural gas. So it turns out that many oil-producing countries, including Kazakhstan, are able to produce a lot of methane, but the problem is a lot of it leaks into the air. And methane is about 50 to 60 times stronger a climate change gas than carbon dioxide. It degrades a lot faster in the atmosphere, but it also warms the planet a lot faster compared to carbon. So it's a major issue. Now, interestingly, as you recall when I talked about how we design policy, one of the things we need to do is be able to monitor what emissions look like. And it turns out we're now developing technologies where satellites in space can fly over areas and detect methane leaks. It used to be that someone like me would have to go in with some special sensor technology and kind of sniff around for the methane. But now we can sniff around from space. And this means that countries that are leaking natural gas, leaking methane into the atmosphere, could be held accountable for that. And indeed, this is something that throughout Central Asia is a challenge. Earlier this year, a methane leakage equal to the amount that Denmark as a country would produce in emissions was discovered from a single place, a single satellite. Now, sometimes this is just due to machinery naturally degrading and something going wrong. Other times, maybe negligence. But nonetheless, this is an example of something that countries could be held accountable for and satellites can monitor and verify. Now, let's take a second to think about how well something like this will work. Now, remember that the idea behind this nerdy thing of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is carbon pricing. That we're somehow going to know how much carbon you emitted when you produced your steel, for example. So it turns out that that might be a relatively easy thing to do for some countries that have lots of technology, lots of know-how how to do it. But what happens for a country like Mozambique in Africa, where they don't have a big government bureaucracy that can be monitoring these things? Or what happens in countries where there might be corruption? So this is an example of something that sounds good on paper, but actually implementing it in places that are at different economic development levels or have different political systems could be a challenge. These are some of the nerdy equations that go into calculating what the carbon border adjustment mechanisms will be. I show these equations not to illustrate that I love mathematics, but only to say there has to be people and technologies behind this that make up these numbers. And anytime you're making numbers up, that's a great opportunity for politics to step in. There's also a much richer geopolitical backdrop. Bjorn Lomborg, who is assailed by many in the climate community, wrote an op-ed that said, as rich countries attempt to export the cost of climate policy to poor countries through carbon adjustment taxes, they will further drive a wedge into an already fractured world. That is to say, that the European Union doing this will just drive other countries into the hands of other geopolitical adversaries that will not go named. Finally, let me turn to climate finance. How many of you remember the Paris Agreement? Is that a common thing? Okay. So a fascinating piece about the Paris Agreement was that almost every country signed on. Now, as someone who studied politics, the fact that every country signed on to an agreement, that's a pretty weird thing to happen. That does not happen very often. So why was it that that happened? Well, there were a couple things. First of all, the Paris Agreement itself has no teeth to it. It's all voluntary. So countries were like, sure, I'll sign on to something where I don't really have to do something if I don't want to, or if I don't do the thing I said I was going to do, there's no penalty. Sure, why not? The second reason countries in the global south signed on to the Paris Agreement is that they were told that they're going to get about $100 billion per year in climate finance. What has happened? Well, $100 billion hasn't happened, I'll tell you that much. Furthermore, a lot of it has come in the terms of loans rather than grants. Now, the reality is the funding gaps that are needed are simply staggering. And remember what I started out with. It simply does not matter if economies like the United States and the European Union decarbonize. That'll be nice if we did, but it won't matter unless Indonesia, Africa, Central Asia, China, etc., also decarbonize. And how are these countries going to do it if they are highly in debt? This is an estimate of the gap between where we are and where we need to be. And I assure you, it is a tough challenge to go into Washington, D.C. and say, hey, let's take some of that money that we could keep in our own country and send it to other countries. That's a tough challenge, even if we had committed to it. And a lot of that money, to the extent that it does flow, is entirely around mitigation. And that's another big open question. Is that the right mix? What exactly is the right mix of money that we should be spending on mitigation versus adaptation? I don't have that answer. However, to put it in perspective, we sure do a great job at spending a lot of money on other things, especially our military. So there is the capacity to marshal the type of money that is needed to make this transition, but it takes political will. This is a picture of an old oil well and an oil spill. And this will be the last part until I turn to education and its implications. And I show these things for a reminder of a couple things. First of all, fossil fuels are a dirty business, by and large. At the same time, they powered our economy for well over a century. An upcoming challenge will be what some colleagues of mine have called the mid-transition. What does this mean? Decommissioning, that is to say, stopping the production of oil and gas, will be a very hard process. It's not like a water faucet where you go and you kind of like, all right, I'm done washing my hands, I turn it off, we're good. It's not even close to that. It's also going to take decades to do. It's going to take decades to turn off these oil wells. And at the same time, we're telling the owners of these oil wells that the value of that asset, the value of that oil, is also going down because we don't want people to use it. So that's scary, because that means that those people and those companies and those countries have less of an incentive to do that decommissioning, to phase out fossil fuels in an environmentally safe way. And if we screw this up, if we mess this up, the environmental catastrophes could be profound. In the state of Pennsylvania, which is a state in the United States, there are over 300,000 abandoned oil wells that are leaking methane. Abandoned. No one's in charge of them. So how will this play out? And how will the international community deal with this in light of the fact that, remember, methane leak from one source doesn't matter where it is to the planet. So this brings me then to thinking about the implications of all of this for education. What I tried to do is lay out complexity. Complexity that is inherent in sets of policies that are trying to deal with a global challenge, but a global challenge that is driven by something that also drives our economies. This transition, if we are to succeed, will be complex at a minimum. And in my view, that requires that our educational systems embrace that complexity and adopt a set of strategies that does not embrace simplistic solutions, that does not embrace idealism, but instead embraces complexity and realism. This complexity is social. For example, what do we do about whole communities that produce coal, and that's all they produce? Do we just say, sorry, here's a suitcase, move somewhere else? Is that what we should do? Economists think that sometimes. That would be the more efficient thing. Here's a suitcase with $100, go move away. I assure you that's a great way to get punched in a bar. It's complicated legally. Who is liable legally for an abandoned well when the company that abandoned that well had declared bankruptcy? The complexity is scientific. Should we be trying to minimize methane leakage over carbon? The engineering challenges are immense. How do we drive down the cost of renewable energy? Should we embrace nuclear energy? I hear a topic of conversation here in Kazakhstan. Students need to be put in positions then that honors this complexity, but importantly helps them see other perspectives. For example, a former student of mine, Arzon, we designed a simulation that was about how Kazakhstan should deal with CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that nerdy thing I was talking about before. Turns out there are lots of different interests in Kazakhstan, some of which might like to do more and have a carbon price, and others that absolutely don't want to have a carbon price. But importantly, you need to be able to understand the perspective of the other parties at the table. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're solely in a context where some professor is up and talking and talking and talking. We need to put our students in the driver's seat. We also need to equip our students to understand that because of the profound economic implications for different communities, industries, countries, there will be contestation. There will be debate. And as such, equipping students with real debate and negotiation skills will be crucial. It might be that some of our students use those debate and negotiation skills to prolong our dependency on fossil fuels. That's okay in my view, because there will be lots of other students who are equipped with debate and negotiation skills to give them a tougher time. One of the things that I oftentimes hear from countries is that then they go to big United Nations convenings about climate, it's always the Western countries that have teams and teams, lots of people that are highly trained and they have law degrees. And then there's like the 3-person delegation from a small island country, and they're just outmatched. They're not trained in the ability to negotiate, and they don't have a chance. Fourth, science and engineering students need to understand topics like economics. It is way too common, including at places like Harvard University, for us to completely segment and say, oh, over here, you just do science and engineering, and over here, you just do policy and economics. I recently taught a course at Harvard's business school called Energy. And one of the things that I told the business students was, you're going to have to remember certain principles like the second law of thermodynamics. And at first, they're like, I'm a business student. And I said, yeah, you'll be a broke business student if you go into the energy sector and don't remember some basic science rules. So just as science and engineering students need to understand policy and economics, it's incumbent on non-science and non-engineering students to remember that we live in a world where there are real physical constraints. We are not going to be able to sit in a dorm room, burning a candle, singing Kumbaya, and get our way out of this. It needs to be realistic, and it will be governed by things like physics and the laws of chemistry. Finally, issues of justice and ethics should be at the forefront. Even if people disagree about what is just or what is ethical. Should we care about those communities that produce coal and that's all they produce? Should we care about small island countries? How should we weight the risks of nuclear disaster versus the fact that nuclear energy does not create emissions that are frying our planet? How do we weight those things? How do we debate them? Are the questions about justice and ethics about our generations now or future generations? And how much should we even value those future generations? This is what economists call the discount factor or the discount rate. Should I value the lives of people that are yet unborn in the policies that I make? It turns out that is a deep question that is heavily debated when we're forming policies. But if we don't put those issues of justice and ethics at the forefront, it'll just come back and bite you later. So what I tried to do today is illustrate that the policy landscape around climate change is incredibly complex, and that complexity hence requires a fundamental rethinking about the way that we engage in education. And finally, I'll end with a question I sometimes get, which is, dear Professor Tingley, why do you care so much about education? Why do you chair these committees and come to places as amazing as this wedding ballroom to talk about this? Why do I do it? I do it for a very simple reason. If I can inspire in one of my classes of, say, 50 students, 30 of them to go out and try to drive for solutions, that's 1 to 30 multiplier. And then it's 30 to thousands from each of them. That is why we need to move the ball on climate education. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dustin. I think that was just a fantastic way to start off the day. And you know, if you've been awake since 4 o'clock, I didn't see it. So that was really outstanding presentation. So I think in the interest of time, because you know, if we go too much over in this session, that means the next session will go over time, and that will be infringing on lunch, which is something we want to avoid if at all possible. So I will forego my privileges as a moderator, and I think just open the floor up to questions. So what I think maybe we'll do is maybe we'll take questions in groups of say 3, according to the the principle of Pohliby Troitsi. So I would just ask if when asking questions, as always, if you could introduce yourself briefly, and also to keep your questions as concise as possible, just to allow time for as many questions as possible and for as much of a discussion as possible. So okay, so.
Hi, thank you for your excellent presentation. My name is Elena. I work at Narhoz University in Kazakhstan. We do a lot of international projects, including ESD projects. My question is about what is the state of climate justice education at Harvard or maybe in other US universities, and how much is our region or other regions of the world taking into account into that climate justice education? Because we're starting to do some climate justice education here, but I'd like to hear maybe your thoughts, experience. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we'll take 2 more questions and then turn it over to Dustin.
Раз. Дастин, спасибо большое. Я вопрос свой на русском задам, потому что хочу собраться с мыслями.
Так, научный годинник.
I barely speak English, so give me a second.
Дастин, спасибо большое за такой критический взгляд. По крайней мере, я сейчас понимаю, что когда мы работаем над образованием в области климатических изменений, нам необходимо поднимать вопросы о макрополитике и макроэкономике, для того, чтобы ученики и учителя наши понимали, что меньшее потребление или меньший консюмеризм не ведет не совсем... Это маленькая часть того, что нам нужно делать, развивая зеленые навыки. Вы можете из своего опыта сказать, где, может быть, в каких странах есть такой передовой опыт, когда макрополитика и макроэкономика является частью климатического образования в школах? Потому что, смотря вот на вот этот критический взгляд, многие политики будут считать это очень политизированным подходом. Поэтому вот как, может быть, есть какие-то у вас советы по поводу того, как эти вопросы поднимать, а их нужно поднимать, и в то же время быть предельно осторожным, чтобы вот все вот это содержание, о чем вы говорили, было у нас в национальных curriculum. Спасибо.
Хорошо, спасибо. Еще один вопрос. One more question.
Thank you, Dustin. Hugh McLean, CAPS Unlock team. I'm sure many of you will agree with me that was one of the best and most refreshing discussions on climate and the link between education that I've heard, actually. So I think that says something about the status of our discussions and about education and climate. But my point is, if the question is from the education point of view, what you're calling for in education actually stands quite contrary to some of the trends we're seeing in education, which are all about narrowing around the technical skills. We're seeing defunding of humanities at higher education level. Right through school, there's a lack of emphasis on all of those other aspects that we as educators fight for when it comes to ideas around quality education. So if you could just think about, provide some comments on the pushback that is needed, perhaps against a neoliberal idea about management that affects all of those sectors you mentioned.